Hi, let me share with you the top 5 lessons learned I took from 4 years of building defensive measures for Microsoft 365. This video is a recording of the session I did for the Netherlands chapter of ISACA on September 25th in Eindhoven. It will be published on YouTube and I will divide the recording in chapters so you may quickly jump to the parts that are of interest to you. My name is Erik and I'm one of the founders of Zolder, and we have created Ethics Security, which amongst other things provides protection for Microsoft 365. So the first question of course is about relevance. How important is it actually to be defending Microsoft 365? So in the real live session it was quite telling that some attendants answered, well, no priority at all because this is Microsoft's responsibility. Now, regardless how you feel about Microsoft and the inherent security of their services, it is always the responsibility of a business itself to provide for its own security, which of course a service provider might help with using some tooling, but this never will take away your responsibility to be aware of your own risks. So the answer to this question should be based on real-world insights in data breaches and leaks. How do they happen, and to what extent does it have anything to do with Microsoft 365? So recently a report emerged from ENISA about the current threat landscape. And in other words, it gives statistics about how cyber threats work and how often they occur. So it's a perfect source to find an answer to our question. I always take note of overall conclusions in such reports, and the more relevant it is to our region or the business, the better. So ENISA reports, which is a part of the European Union, for sure grabbed my attention, so I dove in. But when I saw their overall graph, I did not feel right. In this you can see that denial of service type of attacks are the top threat. But now, I can imagine that it is true and actually cause a lot of pain, but I consider DDoS or DOS as a whole different animal, and to be honest, I am more interested in the other categories. But when looking at the other categories, I felt something is off too, because these are not mutually exclusive. A social engineering threat could well be the precursor to a ransomware attack, for instance. In fact, in my reality, phishing and just logging in mostly are the entry points leading to ransomware attacks. But I couldn't find anything in the ENISA report explaining overlap in some way between these categories. And if the conclusion is that social engineering, including phishing, with just 6% of all incidents is just number 4 in list of top threats, really does not feel right to me. It might give a completely false impression to CISOs as to where to put their attention. So to be honest, not so happy with this report, therefore. Then roughly about the same time I was listening to Risky Business, and Patrick mentioned this report by CISA actually stating that stolen credentials are the top threat.
We got a finding here out of a CISA audit, which I think is interesting because I've seen a number of people making the same claim, and it's one that I happen to agree with, which is that stolen creds are still the number one risk out there to enterprise computing environments, right? Which is, you know, we're on this show, we love talking about sophisticated O-Day, we love talking about the latest TTPs, but fundamentally the way people are getting rinsed. And this is something that, sponsor guests like Ryan Callenber from Proofpoint just love hammering away at, which is it's still just stolen creds and cred stuffing. And, that's the stuff that's resulting in most of the harm. So it's good to see CISA put out some work on this and sort of back up the claim.
So this feels more in line with our experience. So I dug up the report, which is the annual analysis of CISA into risk and vulnerability assessment. And here it says that valid accounts, in other words, actual credentials to log into a system, are the most used way in which attackers get into organizations in the first place. In 41% of cases, a valid account was the initial access vector. And the initial access part is where the CISA report is more useful than an ENISA one, in my opinion, because CISA maps the threats to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which underwrites that cyber threats happen in phases. And attackers use different techniques in all of these phases. In other words, it underwrites that certain technical threats are not mutually exclusive and one might well lead to the other. Now, the initial access factor is the one where one should focus on to install preventative measures, because this phase, after all, is where attackers start. If you don't stop them, it will be way harder to tackle them, especially when they have a valid account, so they log in as just one of your colleagues. It will be quite hard to dissect malicious behavior from ordinary behavior. Now, in this chart, you can see what techniques are mostly used as the initial access factor. As said, valid accounts are used in 41% of the cases, but the other categories involve phishing and password cracking, centering really around identities and email. And actually, 88% of all incidents start with threats or phishing. And for organizations using Microsoft 365, email and identities, they really reside right there. So to answer the question whether defending Microsoft 365 should be a priority, I guess the clear answer is no. It should not be a priority, it should be the priority. So, let me give you my personal 5 lessons learned in defending Microsoft 365. Lesson number 1 is really quite a current one and involves the technique of adversary in the middle attacks and token replay. And not long ago, it was Microsoft itself actually that warned for a sharp increase of this type of attacks. They observed a 111% increase in token replay attacks in just 1 year. And through this technique, an attacker is able to obtain access to a user account even though it is protected with multi-factor authentication. It is the way to obtain a valid account, log into your business and perform their cybercrime activities. And this appears to be so successful that we see cybercrime as a service offering this technique increasing rapidly. And let me show you how it works. So, in this video you see that someone is trying to log into a website which is not actually running at Microsoft. You see the URL is not a Microsoft one, but it does resemble the login page of Microsoft. And actually it's a live copy of that website, because on this website, the URL that we are visiting, some technique is running there which is called a proxy server, and it basically acts as a website and receives your visit, and then in the background it connects to Microsoft itself and basically makes a live copy of the pages it receives from Microsoft and hands it over to you as the visitor. So you see actually what Microsoft is serving to you. So here the visitor has entered their email address, and now Microsoft knows to what organization you belong and asks for the password. Now the password is entered, and also the multi-factor authentication process is initiated. I get a prompt, log in, are you sure? Yes. Now this malicious website now forwards me to the office.com domain, which is the regular and legitimate Microsoft website, but as I did not actually log in, I do not have a session here. So as a visitor, I might now consider that for some reason my login attempt I just finished did not work. I don't know, I just try it again, right? So you might well not be aware at this point that you have already been phished. Now, from an attacker perspective, all the information that was entered into the cloned version of Microsoft is now stored, and the attacker can now get this information from the logs that were entered in their website. And here we already have the username and password, which is just stored in plain text, and we can use those. But obviously, as the account is protected by MFA, this is not enough to actually log into Microsoft. So what also happens is that when logging in, after the MFA prompt is successful, Microsoft basically shares like a cookie session, and this holds like a unique code. And this code basically tells Microsoft that we have a logged in session, and our browser uses this session to keep being logged in. So If I now go to another website of Microsoft, it still uses this session to authorize me so that I don't have to enter the login information all the time. So a session cookie it is basically some kind of a password, but now it's a logged in version of my password, and I can then simply copy it and perform the authentication again. So now the attacker has copied the cookie, and through some tooling within the browser is able to enter that cookie into its session to the real Microsoft website. And now Microsoft accepts the cookie and just accepts the fact that we have a logged in session and brings me to the actual website of Microsoft for this user. So copying a session token is really the way they would get through the MFA process. Now we are running this particular version of the Evil Jinx software, which is a proxy like that, on a POC website, which you can visit yourself. It's at dscm.dev, and here you can see how this actually works. You don't need to enter all your passwords if you don't want to, but by just entering your email address, you will see that actually you get the login process that Microsoft is supposed to give. So Evil Jinx is one of the tools out there, and although it's out there for quite some time, it's still quite hard for a typical attacker to use it. So this sparks cybercrime as a service. So other attackers that are able to run this kind of stuff and then offer it as a service to other ones that are more script kiddies. So we see Evil Proxy, for instance, offering this kind of tooling, and also Tycoon, and this is increasing. So there's more and more offerings of cybercrime as a service involving adversary in the middle attacks. So what can you do about them? Well, first of all, the things you can do is that you can, first of all, introduce a strong method of multi-factor authentication to log into your Microsoft environment. This strong method of authentication will involve, like for instance, the FIDO2 USB keys that you have to plug into your computer or connect to your mobile device, and they are then your multi-factor method. So they probably will be a little bit less user-friendly and also maybe a bit expensive to give to all your users. So if that is too much, you might consider to only apply this to users with admin privileges, because if someone who is actually an admin in your environment, its credentials are stolen, then obviously an attacker has these same privileges as well. So those are the first accounts you want to add extra strong authentication for. Other things to do are compliance-based conditional access policies, where the attacker's proxy is not known to Entra and therefore unable to log in. This approach, however, is not bring your own device friendly, so be careful to enable this, because also bring your own devices are not known to Entra by default. Then you may also consider using a CSS trick to detect and visually label cloned versions of the login page, like in the example you see here. But you can well build this yourself or use our platform of Ethic with Did Someone Clone Me to achieve this. And lastly, I advise you to switch on safe links, which will provide at click time detection of malicious URLs and prevent users from browsing there. So if someone's lured into a cloned version of the Microsoft login page, then Microsoft will quite quickly detect that URL actually as a malicious site and then prevent your users to actually go there. It's a nice feature, these safe links, and it's in Business Premium and E3, not available to all Microsoft customers, but a lot of you will be able to use it, but it's not switched on by default. So there's also a lot of other stuff that are even in the higher licenses. So like E5, for instance, it requires Azure Premium P2 license. So yeah, there's a lot more available within Defender framework, but for the more regular license, these are the things that you would be able to do. And I really advise you to do this because ATM is now really booming and there's a lot of attacks going on like this. Then lesson 2 involves privilege management. Now, in the old days, we were used to think about this topic in the context of employees and their own user accounts. And least privilege, for instance, is the principle of not awarding higher rights to users than they require to perform their job, and which already is hard enough to live by for a typical SMB in reality, but in the cloud this topic has become way more difficult. You see, in Microsoft and other cloud services, we were introduced with a phenomenon called OAuth apps. And these apps are really cloud services that interact with systems on behalf of a user. And this way we can have, for instance, extensions to Outlook like calendar and availability management, or contact synchronization to CRM tooling. Now, apps like these, they register something called a service principal in your Microsoft tenant. And these service principals can hold the same privileges as regular users can. Now, imagine someone to be faked into believing they are installing some nice add-on into their Microsoft account under false pretenses. Will you detect that? Will you regularly do a scan of registered service principals and their privileges? And furthermore, we learned that there appear to exist administrative rules in Enter ID that you cannot see. Sounds nice, eh? But it's actually true. A couple of rules are hidden in the user interface, and you may only see who or which service principal has been assigned this role using PowerShell. How often do you check this? Yes, regularly evaluating assigned roles, including service principals, is very wise to do. Lesson number 3 is the simplicity basically of creating fully open shares in the cloud era. They are just not called open shares anymore, but public SharePoint sites and teams. You see, when creating a new site in SharePoint or a new team in Microsoft Teams, you will be asked whether the privacy of it should be set to public or private. And public feels good often, as your colleagues are then able to just open the files in their environment or in their browser. However, often over time, documents and files stored in SharePoint or Teams might grow to contain quite sensitive data. Data that maybe should not be accessible to all colleagues in the first place, but more importantly, it allows an attacker, after obtaining a valid account, to just go into SharePoint and browse through all these sites and see what data is in there. Data like passwords, which allows them to go further down the attack chain, or data that might be useful for blackmailing you into paying a ransom fee. So, make users do not create public SharePoint sites if it's not public data in there. And are you already monitoring for newly created public sites? Lesson 4 and 5 are about making use of the stuff that you are paying for, but is not enabled by default. And first of all, Sentinel, which is a SIEM solution within the Microsoft Cloud. Sentinel allows for log monitoring. You connect sources of logs to it, have the logs synced to there, synchronized and stored in storage and made searchable. And like all SIEMs, storage of logs creates extra cost. However, Microsoft allows you to store some logs of their own services in there for 3 months. This allows you to set up basic incident monitoring around the activity that might involve 88% of the initial attack vector we spoke about. And as you are already paying for this stuff, why wouldn't you enable it? And once it is running and you have your incident handling process in place within your organization, it might be a great starting point to extend upon into other areas of log monitoring. Lesson 5. These are the other make use of what you pay for, and they are about premium features. So they don't apply to all Microsoft 365 customers, but if you use Business Premium or E3, then it does. These features are in your license, but not enabled by default, so take note. First is user impersonation. This is functionality to stop emails that come from outside the organization, but are sent from a name or email address that looks like an internal colleague. This typically would stop phishing or pretexting emails that mislead colleagues into believing they received a message from their CEO or CFO, for instance. And what you need to do is register the colleagues for whom you want to apply this detection and which may be a list of up to 60 users. Now be careful, because if your management is used to emailing themselves from a private account, these might get blocked, or you need to make an exception for those. But still, it's a very powerful feature. Then have a look at phishing mail tips. You might be used to these ugly banner messages indicating that an email is coming from outside the organization. Well, Microsoft has created a better way for the same goal, because these messages are more intelligent. They will only show up when something specific needs your attention, like you never received an email from this particular sender before. It's really helpful to make users aware of potential phishing attempts and not as intrusive as the old banner messages. And lastly, the save links features I mentioned before. If you have the license, switch it on today, really. It may well save you from getting phished and is not intrusive at all. It just is not enabled by default, because rerouting all web visits through Microsoft servers needs to be an opt-in feature, which is quite logical. The save links will work for messages you receive by email, but also other Microsoft 365 channels, particularly Microsoft Teams. And that's all. Now, of course, all these lessons learned come together in the solution we built, in which we are continuously evaluating configuration to see if things are disabled that shouldn't be, roles are assigned that are suspicious, etc. Should you want to have a try, head to ethicsecurity.com/try. I thank you for your attention and hopefully see you in the next session.